Imran Khan, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We speak a month after the collapse of the Afghan government and the takeover of the Taliban. How would you describe the situation in Afghanistan today?
I think it's worrying. Afghanistan is on a historic crossroads. One, if it goes well, and we pray that this works in the direction of peace after 40 years in Afghanistan, if this Taliban hold all of Afghanistan, and if they can sort of now work towards an inclusive government, get all the factions together, Afghanistan could have peace after 40 years. But if it goes wrong, and which is what we are really worried about, it could go to chaos, the biggest humanitarian crisis, a huge refugee problem, unstable Afghanistan, and the reason why the US came in was to fight terrorism or international terrorists. So unstable Afghanistan, refugee crisis, and the possibility of, again, terrorism from Afghanistan soil.
You have said that a positive outcome for Afghanistan would be an inclusive government. Would you call this an inclusive government? Do you support it?
Well, let me just, Becky, explain to the viewers that my party came into power after 22 years. So 22 years we stayed in opposition before we came to power. When we got into power, there was so much pressure for us to include those people who had struggled for 22 years. So they almost had felt that it was a right that they should be included. So I can see the problems they are facing, but I do not think that there would be really peace in Afghanistan unless there's an inclusive government, because Afghanistan is a society composed of different ethnic groups. So the Pashtun is only about 45–50%. They are Tajiks, they are Hazara, they are Uzbeks. So unless it's an inclusive government, the worry is that there will be instability later on.
Well, it's not. It's not an inclusive government at present. Let's agree on that. Afghanistan, you said, had broken the, quote, shackles of slavery when the Taliban took back power. That doesn't sound like the statement of someone who shares the concerns of so many in the world about the future of Afghanistan and its people under the Taliban, notorious for its misogyny, its violence against women, that shows no evidence or interest in guaranteeing basic human rights, particularly those for women.
But
let's just talk about its makeup.
So it has to be put in its context. What was the context? I spoke. For the first time in history, in 74 history of Pakistan, we had what we call was trying to get rid of the colonial system of education. So colonial system of education was a tiny elite had this colonial English medium education, and the masses had another Urdu medium education. And this created two classes. And so for the first time, we had a unified curriculum in our history. And what I was trying to say was that mental slavery, which comes from the colonial form of education, is much worse than physical slavery. And one line I gave example of, in Afghanistan, they have got freedom. Now, I never quite understood what was the issue behind it, because when the British left, it was freedom for Afghanistan. When the Soviets left, it was freedom. So when the US leave, what am I supposed to say?
This interim government is not an inclusive government. The concerns of so many around the world are for the future of Afghanistan and its people under a Taliban government which is notorious for its misogyny and its violence against women. There is no evidence to date of any interest in providing basic human rights, particularly for women and children. How concerned are you about that. This is an interim government, you might tell me, but you know what? The last Taliban government was an interim government and it lasted 5 years. So how concerned are you? And what are you going to do about it?
Look, Becky, where Afghanistan goes from here, I'm afraid none of us can predict. We can hope and pray that there's peace after 40 years, that the Taliban, what they have said, that they want an inclusive government, they want women rights in their own context, they want human rights, they've given amnesty. So far what they have said, clearly they want international acceptability. They did not go for international acceptability when they were between 1996 to 2001. This time, clearly they're making the statements where they want this acceptability. So we should try and incentivize them in that direction. But there's another fallacy. Afghanistan cannot be controlled by outside. They have a history. No puppet government in Afghanistan is supported by the people. It gets discredited amongst the people. So rather than sitting here and thinking that we can sort of control them, we should incentivize them. Because Afghanistan, this current government, clearly feels that without international aid and help, they will not be able to stop this crisis. So we should incentivize them, push them in the right direction.
If it seeks legitimacy, it will need to show evidence that it shares the values of those that it is seeking legitimacy for, and that being the West, for example. I grew up watching you as a star of Pakistan's cricket team. The Taliban have said that women shouldn't play cricket. In fact, they've said women shouldn't be involved in sport at all. This is the sort of Taliban that we are seeing today. Do you support that? I mean, women have been protesting about more inclusivity, about their rights. We know women, first-hand experience, women are too frightened to come out of their homes. They're too frightened to go to the workplace if they're allowed at all. They've been flogged. I mean, do you support their cause?
Look, Becky, first of all, let us just compare what happened after the Soviets left in 1989 and compare to what the situation is right now when the US has departed from Afghanistan. When the Soviets left in 1989, the sort of bloodbath that took place, over 200,000 Afghans died in that bloodbath. Now compare that to what has happened now. Frankly, I mean, we were all relieved. We expected a bloodbath. When Ashraf Ghani said that he left Afghanistan because he was scared of a bloodbath in Kabul, well, it could have happened. We were worried that when the US departed, there would be complete chaos in Afghanistan, civil war. Our intelligence agencies told us that Taliban would not be able to take over all of Afghanistan. And if they tried to take over Afghanistan militarily, there would be a protracted civil war, which is what we were scared of, because we are the ones who would suffer the most. So therefore now, in that, bearing in mind what could have happened and what has happened, I feel give them time. I feel very strongly that it's a mistake to think that someone from outside will give Afghan women rights. Afghan women are strong. Give them time. They will get their rights.
You've just alluded to your very real concerns about the risks of civil war, the risks to Afghanistan, and indeed the risks to Pakistan. I want to come back to your very real concerns about the risks to Pakistan's national security in a moment. But bear with me, you have criticised the US pullout. Let me start that again. You have criticised the US pullout from Afghanistan, describing America as having messed it up in Afghanistan. Is that something that you have told the US president personally? Have the two of you spoken since the collapse of the country?
I have spoken to, then he was Senator Joe Biden, way back in 2008. After 2006, we in Pakistan began to realize that this is now going to become a quagmire for the US. I went over to the US. I met Senator John Biden, Senator John Kerry, and Senator Harry Reid. I also addressed various think tanks in the US. And I tried to explain to them there is a history of Afghanistan. What the US is trying to achieve militarily, this is not going to happen. And so they will be stuck there. Our army chief in 2010, he went over to the US. He tried to tell President Obama that you're not going to have a military victory. The Afghan army is not going to be able to, the moment you go, it will wilt. So we were warning them beforehand. And when the US should have started from a position of strength to do a political settlement with the Taliban when there were 150,000 US troops there.
Let me stop you there. You haven't spoken to the President of the United States since the collapse of the country to the Taliban, correct?
No, I haven't.
He hasn't called you since coming into office, correct?
He's a busy man.
Pakistan is a major non-NATO ally, and yet no call between you and the US President. Do you see this as punishment for supporting the Taliban while they were killing US troops?
But you have to ask him why he's too busy to call. But let me just say one thing. I heard this, the Senate hearing going on, which Secretary Blinken was asked all these questions. I want to say this, and I hope that the American politicians would listen to this. You know, Pakistan is the country. Just because we sided with the US, we became an ally of the US after 9/11 in the war in Afghanistan. The suffering this country went through. At one point, there were 50 militant groups attacking our government. In the 80s, Pakistan joined the US against the Soviets. We trained the Mujahideen to do jihad in Afghanistan. Amongst them was Al-Qaeda, Taliban were part of the Mujahideen groups. We trained them that foreign occupation, fighting against them, is a sacred duty, is jihad, is a holy war. Fast forward to 9/11, US needs us in Afghanistan. They asked us to join us. A lot of people said that we were abandoned in 1989. The US, after the war was over, left, sanctioned Pakistan. So come 2001, George Bush asked Pakistan to help. And he famously said, we will not abandon Pakistan again. Pakistan joined the US war in Afghanistan. Was I the Prime Minister? I would never have done that. Firstly, the same Mujahideen, now we are telling them because US has invaded Afghanistan, now it's terrorism. They turn against us. Then all the tribal belt of Pashtuns on our side of the border, the Pashtun nationalism kicked in. So they had all sympathies with the Taliban, not because religious ideology, because of Pashtun ethnicity. So you must understand what happened. No, I really want people to know. They turned against the Pakistan army as collaborators. So the jihadis turned against us, the Pashtuns turned against us, and the more we tried the military operations in civilian areas, the more collateral damage, the more. So we had 50 militant groups attacking us. And on top of it, they must also know, there were 480 drone attacks by the US in Pakistan. Only time a country has been attacked by its ally. So we almost went under. Had it not been for our army, a disciplined army and best intelligence agencies, you know, we lost 80,000 people. 80,000 Pakistanis died in it. And on top of it, rather than one word of appreciation, I saw them blaming us.